The fluorescent lights in Station 3's equipment bay hummed with a frequency that made Kira's teeth ache. It was 6 a.m. on a Saturday, and she was on her knees scrubbing mud off the boots of firefighters who wouldn't even look her in the eye. The concrete floor was cold against her knees, seeping through her work pants like ice water. She'd been volunteering here for 6 months, 6 months of cleaning gear, stocking ambulances, and taking the shifts no one else wanted. During the week, she worked dispatch for the County Park Service, answering radio calls from lost hikers. Simple work, safe work, nothing like what she used to do. The radio crackled. Engine 12, respond to brush fire, Highway 9 mile marker 23. The static carried a note of urgency that made Kira pause mid-scrub. Hey, weekend girl! Rhett's voice cut through the bay like a rusty blade. He was leaning against Engine 3, arms crossed, smirk planted on his face like it had been welded there. Make sure you get the laces spotless. We've got a real call later. The other firefighters laughed, harsh sounds that echoed off concrete walls. Kira didn't look up. She just tightened her grip on the brush until her knuckles turned white. Then the station alarm went silent. The sudden quiet felt wrong, like pressure building before a storm. The bristles scraped against leather with methodical precision. They thought she was weak, playing dress-up on weekends because she had nothing better to do. What they didn't know was that her hands had once built fire lines that saved entire towns. What they didn't know was that she'd earned the call sign Ghost, fighting fires most of them had only seen on the evening news. But that was before the Shasta fire. Before her captain died because she made the wrong call during a wind shift. Before the nightmares started and never stopped. You missed a spot, Rhett said, pointing to a scuff. Weekend warriors always miss the details. The words hit their mark. But Kira just nodded and reached for the polish. She'd heard worse. Much worse. During her CAL FIRE years, she'd been tested by instructors who could reduce grown men to tears. Outside, another siren wailed in the distance, then another. Whatever was burning out there, it was growing. The alarm pierced the morning quiet at 7:43 a.m., its electronic wail slicing through Station 3 like a knife. Structure fire, 1247 Maple Street, Engine 3, Ladder 1, respond. The dispatcher's voice crackled through speakers with professional urgency. Kira watched the professional crew spring into action, movements practiced and fluid. Rhett slid down the pole, landing with a heavy thud that shook the floor. Volunteer stays here, Chief Torres called over his shoulder as he climbed into Engine 3's passenger seat. Monitor the radio. Answer phones. The engine's diesel rumbled to life, drowning out any response she might have made. Red lights painted the bay walls as they rolled out, sirens wailing. The V sound faded, leaving only silence and diesel fumes. Kira stood in the empty bay, alone. Through the radio she could hear their chatter. Light smoke showing first floor. Establishing water supply. Standard structure fire protocol she'd run hundreds of times, but never here. Never with. The phone rang with its shrill demand. Fire Station 3, this is Kira. A brush fire behind Walmart. Small, probably contained, but she took details anyway. Another call about a gas leak. Then a car accident with minor injuries. She fielded them all with crisp efficiency, while part of her wished she was anywhere but behind this desk. Through the window, she could see smoke rising from multiple directions. More than usual for a Saturday morning. When the crew returned 2 hours later, faces smudged with soot and satisfaction, Red announced, nice easy one. Kitchen fire. Had it knocked down in 10 minutes flat. He stripped off his air pack and let it drop to the floor with a metallic clang. Right next to the boots Kira had just finished cleaning. The message was clear. Real firefighters made messes. Volunteers cleaned them up. The radio crackled. All units, be advised of red flag warning conditions developing. No one seemed to notice except Kira. Her stomach tightened. The wind started changing at 2:30 that afternoon, bringing with it the kind of atmospheric pressure that made experienced wildland firefighters nervous. Kira noticed it first while washing Engine 3, working methodically with soap and water. The air had been still all morning, hanging over the valley like a heavy blanket. Now it carried a different quality. Dry, electric, dangerous. She paused and scanned the horizon with eyes trained to read signs most people missed entirely. In the distance, maybe 20 miles toward the national forest, a thin column of smoke rose against blue sky, barely visible, just a faint gray line that could have been mistaken for industrial pollution. But Kira's stomach tightened as she watched it. The column was too straight, too defined, too persistent, and it was growing. Just a smoke check, Chief Torres said when dispatch called it in 45 minutes later. Probably a campfire someone didn't put out properly. He assigned it to Engine 7 from the East Station. Routine. Nothing to worry about. But Kira kept watching. It wasn't behaving like a campfire. Campfire smoke was inconsistent, shifting with thermal currents. This column was steady, organized, the smoke of something that intended to grow. By 4 p.m., wind was gusting to 15 mph. By 5 it was 20, rattling bay doors like something trying to get in. Kira felt it in her bones, the familiar electricity that preceded something big. The radio went quiet for 30 seconds. Never a good sign. She'd learned to read wind like other people read books. This wind had teeth. "Chief," she said quietly as he passed by, "that column isn't campfire smoke. It's too organized, too persistent for any normal burn. And with this wind..." Rhett looked up from his equipment check, smirk spreading wider. "You clean boots weekend, girl. You don't predict fires." The other crew members laughed on cue. "Engine 7's got it handled," Torres said, barely glancing up from his clipboard. "Forest Service is probably already on scene. Stay focused on your duties." But Kira couldn't focus on anything else. She pulled out her phone and checked weather data. Relative humidity dropping fast, temperature climbing, wind speeds increasing with no sign of letting up. The combination made her chest tight with recognition. She'd seen these exact conditions before. On the Shasta fire, right before everything went catastrophically wrong and her captain's voice went silent on the radio. At 6:15, the radio crackled. "We're going to need some help out here." The calm in the dispatcher's voice was gone. Then the power lines started sparking in the wind, sending orange showers into the dry brush below. "All available units, respond to Forest Service Road 47 for wildfire assistance. Multiple structures threatened." The dispatcher's voice had lost its casual tone, replaced by something harder. Kira watched the professional crew scramble for gear, but this time something was different. Tension in their movements, uncertainty in their eyes, fear in the way Rhett fumbled with his turnout gear. They were city firefighters. Structure fires were their bread and butter. But wildfire, that was different entirely. That was nature fighting back. "Volunteer stays at the station," Chief Torres commanded as he climbed back into Engine 3. "Monitor radio traffic. Take messages." The engine pulled out, followed by the ladder truck. Their sirens dopplered into the distance, leaving emptiness behind. Kira was alone again. But this time the emptiness felt loaded with potential catastrophe. Through the radio, she listened to chaos unfold. Fire has jumped the road. Spot fires established on east flank, requesting air support. The terminology was familiar, but she could hear panic underneath. These men had never fought a fire that fought back. A transformer exploded somewhere, close enough to rattle the station windows. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former CAL fire. "Captain, heard about Willowbrook Fire on scanner. That's your area, right? Be careful, Ghost. Wind's pushing it hard. This could get bad fast." The nickname hit like a punch to the gut. Ghost. Because she could move through a fire zone like smoke itself, invisible until she struck with tactical precision, a name she'd tried to bury along with everything else. "Engine 3 to dispatch." Rhett's voice crackled, higher than usual, fear bleeding through the radio static. "Fire's moving faster than expected. We're pulling back to establish new perimeter. Repeat, we are in retreat." The wind outside was howling now, rattling bay doors. Kira closed her eyes and did the math. Wind speed, terrain slope, fuel load, relative humidity. The numbers painted a picture she didn't want to see. The fire was going to make a run, a big one, the kind that made headlines and left scars on landscapes for decades, and it was headed straight for town. At 7:30 p.m., the power went out across the entire valley. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing Station 3 in eerie red glow like blood on concrete. Through the radio, now running on backup power, came the news everyone had been dreading. Willowbrook Fire, now estimated at 500 acres and growing. Evacuation orders for Zones 1 through 3. Zone 3 included downtown. Zone 3 included everything Kira could see from the station windows. Kira's chest constricted. The fire was less than 2 miles out, moving at 3 miles per hour. That gave the town maybe 40 minutes before evacuation became impossible, maybe 30 if the wind picked up again. She grabbed her gear bag from her truck, the one piece she'd never unpacked since arriving 6 months ago. Inside were her yellows, the Nomex fire-resistant clothing that had once been like a second skin. She'd sworn she'd never wear them again, sworn she was done with this life. Promises were easy to make when you weren't watching your town burn. "Engine 3 to Station 3. Rhett's voice came over the radio, tight with fear that couldn't be hidden anymore. "We're trapped. Fire jumped the highway behind us, sheltering in place, deploying fire shelters." His voice cracked on the last word. The radio crackled, then went silent. Dead air that felt like a grave. Kira's blood turned to ice. They were cut off. The professional crew was now trapped in aluminum emergency cocoons, praying flames would pass over them, praying they'd see tomorrow. She was the only firefighter left in town, and the only one who knew how to fight this kind of fire, the only one who'd done it before and lived to tell about it. Kira picked up the radio handset. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. For the first time in 6 months, they were rock steady, like coming home to something she'd been running from. "Station 3 to all units. This is Kira." She paused, feeling the weight of what came next. "I'm responding to the fire. Any volunteers willing to assist? Meet me at the community center. We're making a stand." The radio was silent for a heartbeat that felt like eternity. Then, Chief Torres's voice cut through static. "Kira, negative. You are not authorized to—" She turned off the radio. Authorization didn't matter anymore. She had a town to save. The Brush 4 truck started on the first try, its engine turning over with a healthy rumble that sounded like salvation. Kira had been maintaining the aging Wildland engine for months, changing filters, checking pumps while the crew focused on prettier equipment. Now she was grateful for every hour with her hands in its mechanical guts, every bolt she'd tightened, every seal she'd replaced. The diesel rumbled to life, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, the calm that came before battle, the focus that turned chaos into choreography. She pulled out as the first evacuees fled town. Cars packed with belongings and terrified families streamed past going the opposite direction. In their headlights, she could see ash already falling like gray snow. In the distance, orange glow painted the night sky bright enough to read by. The fire was close, maybe 30 minutes out. Maybe less. At the community center, 3 volunteers waited. Dave, a retired teacher whose granddaughter was in 4th grade at Willowbrook Elementary. Sarah, who worked at the bank and had called in sick to be here. Tom, a carpenter whose family had lived in this valley for 4 generations. None were professional firefighters. None had fought wildfire. None had any business being here. But they were here anyway. "What's the plan?" Dave asked, voice steady despite chaos around them. Sirens wailed as police coordinated evacuation. Wind carried smoke and fear and the smell of burning pine. Kira looked at 3 faces, trusting her to have answers. She thought about Rhett's smirk, about being called Weekend Warrior. Then she thought about her CAL FIRE captain's text, about the name she'd tried to leave behind. Ghost. Some ghosts came back for a reason. Some promises were meant to be broken. "We're building a fire break," she said, voice carrying authority it had never held in this town. Command voice, her old captain called it, the voice that made people move without question. "There's a natural gap in fuel load 1/2 a mile east. If we create a backburn line there, we can stop the head of fire." Sarah frowned. "Burn line? You mean set another fire?" "A backburn. We burn out fuel between here and main fire. When it arrives, it'll have nothing left to consume." Kira was already checking equipment with purposeful efficiency, muscle memory taking over. "It's dangerous. If we time it wrong, we could trap ourselves. But it's the only way to save the town." She looked at each of them. "Anyone wants to leave? Do it now. No judgment." Nobody moved. Outside, another transformer exploded. The radio crackled. "Fire spotted across Mill Creek." That was half the distance she'd estimated. Time was running out faster than she'd thought. Dave squared his shoulders. Sarah nodded grimly. Tom said, "Let's save our town." The drip torch felt familiar in Kira's hands, like greeting an old friend after a long separation. She hadn't held one in 2 years, but muscle memory kicked in as she checked fuel level and ignition system. In the right hands, it could save a city. In wrong hands, it could burn one down. The difference was measured in seconds and skill. Kira had steady hands. She used to, at least. Time to find out if she still did. "Dave, you're on water tender," she commanded. "Keep it pressurized. Sarah, you're my lookout. Watch main fire. Tell me if it changes direction or speed. Tom, radio duty. Keep dispatch updated." Her voice carried certainty she didn't fully feel. They moved without question, trusting her in a way her professional crew never had, in a way she wasn't sure she deserved. The fire line stretched across a natural meadow where fuel load was lighter. If she could burn out available fuel, creating black line of already consumed earth, main fire would hit that barrier and lose momentum. Classic hotshot tactic. But never with civilians. Never with entire town depending on getting it right. Never with this much to lose. Kira, Sarah's voice cut through night air. Main fire just crested the ridge, moving fast. I can see individual flame fronts now. Her voice held forced calm. She looked up and felt her stomach drop. Fire wasn't walking anymore. It was running. Wind-driven flames raced down mountainside like a living thing, consuming everything with terrifying efficiency. Individual trees torching like signals, maybe 15 minutes, maybe 10. She ignited the drip torch and started walking the line. Behind her, controlled flames began eating dry grass, creating buffer zone they desperately needed. Each step measured, deliberate. Too fast and backburn would get away from her. Too slow and main fire would arrive before she finished. The margin for error was non-existent. Heat from controlled burn warmed her face, but it was nothing compared to approaching. Inferno. She could feel it now, the radiant heat from the main fire like opening an oven door. Tom, tell dispatch we're conducting burn operations on East Meadow, she called. Keep all aircraft clear. Her voice was steady even as sweat ran down her spine. Radio crackled with new voice. Station 3, this is State Fire Marshal, who is conducting unauthorized burn operations. The voice carried weight of command and barely controlled anger. Kira's heart skipped. The state marshal had been her supervisor at Cal Fire. He knew exactly who she was, knew what she was capable of, for better or worse. A deer burst from the tree line fleeing the approaching flames. Nature knew what was coming. State Marshal, this is Kira, she replied, not breaking stride along fire line. Couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Ghost? Is that really you? Voice carried disbelief and relief in equal measure. I heard you'd retired completely. What are you doing in 80 Run? Willowbrook? Long story, Marshal. Right now I've got backburn in progress. Main fire's 10 minutes out, moving fast. Wind-driven, Class 4 conditions. Need you to keep aircraft clear until I complete the line. She finished eastern section and turned toward southern approach. Copy that, Ghost. All air assets advised to stay north of Meadow. His voice carried weight of command that moved mountains and aircraft. What's your crew composition? Kira glanced at her 3 volunteers performing their tasks with impressive competence. Dave maintaining perfect water pressure. Sarah tracking approaching fire with binoculars she'd grabbed from her car. Tom managing radio traffic like veteran dispatcher. 3 volunteers, all civilians, but they're good people. The best kind of people. She finished eastern section and turned toward southern approach. The drip torch hissed as fuel-fed flames. Marshal, need to ask about professional crew from Station 3. They're safe, sheltered at Rangery. Station, fire passed north of their position. They'll need extraction, but they survived. Relief flooded through her veins. But Ghost, you need to know, wind's about to shift again. Relief flooded through her, followed by renewed focus. Main fire was closer now, close enough to hear. The sound Wildfire makes when running hard. Roar, freight train, hungry beast all rolled into one. A sound that haunted nightmares. But Kira wasn't afraid anymore. She was back in her element, back where she belonged, whether she wanted to admit it or not. Sarah, how's our timing? Fire's at base of slope, Sarah replied steadily. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. Perfect. Kira picked up pace, laying final section of firebreak that would either save town or trap them all. Each drop of fire from the drip torch felt like rolling dice with everything on the line. The radio buzzed. All units, fire has jumped Millbrook Road, closer than expected. Then wind shifted. She felt it before Sarah could shout the warning. Atmospheric pressure change experienced wildland firefighters learned to recognize by instinct. Wind shift, Sarah shouted. Fire's turning toward town. Kira felt the change before she saw it. Atmospheric pressure shift experienced wildland firefighters learned to recognize in their bones. Wind had been pushing fire northeastern toward her prepared burn line. Now it swung northwest. Fire was no longer heading toward her defenses. It was heading directly for residential area, where hundreds of houses sat like kindling, waiting for a match. Everyone in trucks now, she commanded, extinguishing drip torch. Backburn was half complete, but didn't matter anymore. Game had changed completely. They had minutes, not hours. 3 minutes to reposition before fire reached first houses, maybe less. Kira jumped behind wheel of brush 4 and keyed radio. Marshal, we have wind shift. Fire headed for Oak Street subdivision. Repositioning to protect structures. Her hands were steady on the wheel, even as adrenaline sang through her veins. Negative ghost, too dangerous, fire moving too fast. Pull back to safety zone. His command voice carried weight, but Kira was already driving toward neighborhood, volunteers following in their trucks. Through windshield, she could see first houses on Oak Street, modest homes with maintained yards, each representing family's entire life, memories and photographs and everything that mattered. She thought about the 8-year-old girl who'd sold her Girl Scout cookies at station last month, the elderly couple who always waved during patrol. I can't pull back, Marshall. There are people here. People who trusted the fire department to protect them. She'd spent 2 years running from responsibility, from the weight of making life or death calls. Tonight, she was running toward it, fire-crested ridge above subdivision like biblical nightmare. 40-foot flames raced down slope, jumping tree to tree with terrifying speed. But Kira had seen worse. On Shasta Fire, she'd watched flames twice that size swallow mountainsides. Difference was, this time she knew exactly what she was doing. This time she was ready. Dave, set up at Oak and Maple intersection, 200 feet of line fog pattern. Tom, tell Marshall we're making structure protection stand. Sarah, watch for spot fires. Orders came fast and certain. Her crew moved like they'd been training together for years, like they trusted her completely. Outside, the smell of gasoline hit her nose. Someone's car had developed a leak. One wrong ember and it would explode. First embers started falling like snow made of fire. Kira positioned brush 4 at intersection, creating barrier between approaching flames and houses, holding decades of memories. Truck's water cannon could throw stream 150 feet, enough to knock down spot fires before they established, enough to buy time at least. Sarah, quick survey of every house this block. Check for ignition sources, dry leaves in gutters, wood piles against structures, propane tanks. This wasn't about stopping fire anymore. This was about managing it, controlling where it could go, about accepting some losses to prevent total catastrophe. Main fire hit ridge above them like breaking wave. Heat washed over neighborhood in visible distortions, air shimmering like water. But Kira was ready. As first spot fires landed on rooftops, she directed precise water drops that extinguished them. Deadly game of whack-a-mole. But she'd played this game before and won. Tom, tell Marshall we have multiple spot fires, but they're controlled. Request ETA on additional resources. Her voice stayed level, even as Emberstorm intensified. Radio crackled back. Ghost, this is insane. You're putting civilians in danger. She watched Sarah sprint between houses with portable extinguisher, knocking down ember ignitions with professional efficiency. Dave managing water tender like he'd been born to it, adjusting pressure without needing to be told. Tom coordinating radio traffic like veteran commander. These weren't civilians anymore. They were her crew, her responsibility. Marshall, my crew is exactly where they need to be. Fire raged overhead but was passing them by. Strategic positioning working, houses surviving. Each roof still intact was a small victory. For first time in 2 years, Kira felt like herself again, felt like Ghost. A white flash caught her eye, the corner house's propane tank, surrounded by falling embers like fireflies from hell. Then she heard it, the high-pitched whistle of escaping gas, metal stressed by heat beginning to fail. The 500-gallon propane tank sat like a white metal bomb, ticking down to detonation. Kira had missed it in initial survey. Now, with burning debris falling around it and main fire throwing heat from overhead, tank was in imminent danger of catastrophic failure. Bleave, boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, the kind that left craters. If it went, it would take out not just the corner house but probably 2 adjacent structures, and potentially her entire crew. The blast radius would be absolute. Everyone back to trucks. Need to cool that tank before it fails. She positioned brush 4 for approach, but water cannon couldn't reach tank's position behind house. Angle was wrong, distance too far. Someone would have to go on foot with handline. Into the kill zone. I'll take it, Dave volunteered, already reaching for the hose. But Kira shook her head, grabbing hose and fog nozzle. This is hotshot work. High-risk, high-skill operation. Stay on pump, give me good pressure. She looked at narrow passage between houses. Wind direction, radiant heat levels, ember fall patterns, time to bleave if tank continued heating. Doable, but barely. Margin for error measured in seconds. Approach felt like walking into blast furnace. Radiant heat pressed down like physical weight. trying to drive her back. Air shimmered with malevolent energy, superheated to temperatures that could kill in minutes. Embers fell like rain made of fire. But Kira's gear was rated for these conditions, and she'd walked through worse. She moved through ember shower like walking through rain, focused only on white tank ahead. Each step deliberate, maintaining low profile to minimize heat exposure. She reached it as first large embers landed on surface, metal already hot enough to cook on. Working methodically, she began cooling tank with wide spray pattern. Had to be careful. Too much water too fast could thermal shock the metal, crack it, make explosion. Worse. Steam rose in great clouds as water met superheated metal, obscuring vision. "Kira, you need to get out," Sarah's voice through radio. "Fire's making another run at Ridge." Urgency cutting through static. She could see it. Wall of flame advancing for second pass, pushed by relentless wind. But tank temperature was dropping. Another 30 seconds and it would be safe. 60 more seconds, she replied. The hiss of steam was deafening. Sound of approaching fire grew louder, but she'd learned not to run from noise. You ran from heat, wind shifts, structural collapse, never from noise. Noise was just fire talking. Heat was fire acting. Tank hissed as water hit surface, carrying away deadly heat degree by degree. When she finally retreated, propane tank was cool and safe. Neighborhood was intact. Families would have homes to return to. For first time in 2 years, Kira had fought major fire and won without losing anyone. A helicopter appeared over Ridge, searchlight cutting, through smoke like a sword. State Marshal's helicopter landed in elementary school parking lot at 11:45 p.m., rotor wash kicking up ash and debris. Kira watched Marshal climb out, followed by team of investigators and incident commanders. Fire was contained now, held at 2,047 acres by 6 engine companies, 2 air tankers, 3 hotshot crews from neighboring states. Professional response in full effect. But it had been her backburn attempt in structure protection during crucial first hours that saved town. Her and 3 volunteers who had no business succeeding but had anyway. "Ghost," Marshall said as he approached Brush 4. Nickname sounded strange in front of her volunteers. Dave, Sarah, Tom stood nearby, still in borrowed gear, faces streaked with ash but smiling. Exhausted but alive. They'd done something impossible, against all odds. "Marshall," she replied formally. Around them, incident management team was setting up operations. Professional firefighters moved with choreographed precision of major campaign fire, setting up camp, organizing resources, preparing for long haul. Felt familiar and foreign at same time, like watching life that used to be hers, viewed through glass. "We need to talk. About tonight, about Shasta Fire 2 years ago, about why you disappeared from firefighting community." His voice was gentle but firm. Kira looked back toward Oak Street neighborhood, where porch lights were beginning to flicker on as power started restoring. Families would return to intact homes because of decisions she'd made in last 6 hours. "I didn't disappear. I came here, learned how to be useful in different way." She gestured toward her volunteer crew, who were sharing water and quiet conversation. Marshall studied her face in emergency lighting. "Shasta Fire wasn't your fault. Wind shift that killed Morrison, nobody could have predicted it. Investigation cleared you. You know that." Kira nodded. Intellectually, she'd always known it wasn't her fault. Emotionally was a different story. "I know, but I needed time to figure out what came next. Needed to learn to live with it." She gestured toward her volunteer crew. Sarah was showing Tom something on her phone, both laughing despite exhaustion. Maybe this is what comes next. Teaching instead of fighting. Commotion from highway interrupted them. Engine 3 was returning, crew finally extracted from shelter position, looking shaken but whole. She watched Rhett climb down from cab, face pale but unmarked, eyes wide with the look of someone who'd stared at mortality through aluminum foil. He'd survived his first real wildfire, but barely. That kind of experience changed people. His eyes found hers across parking lot. Recognition hit him like physical blow, really seeing her for the first time. Rhett stared at her with new eyes, seeing someone he'd never bothered to actually look at before. Behind him, rest of Station 3 crew emerged like soldiers returning from first battle. They deployed emergency shelters and waited while fire raged around them, probably praying they'd live to see morning, each of them carrying that haunted look that would take weeks to fade. Humbling experience that fundamentally changed how firefighters viewed their profession, how they viewed their own mortality. "What are you doing here?" Chief Torres called out, spotting her near command vehicle. His voice carried confusion and something else, maybe respect, maybe just exhaustion. "I thought I told you to stay at station." "Station was evacuated when power went out, Chief. Someone needed to protect structures." Her voice was calm, factual. Marshall stepped forward and Torres's expression shifted as he recognized state official. "Chief, I'd like you to meet one of finest wildland firefighters I've ever worked with. Kira, formerly of CAL FIRE Hotshot Crew 7, call sign, Ghost." Silence that followed was profound. Ash fell around them like snow. Rhett's mouth fell open. Torres looked like he'd been told his volunteer was actually governor in disguise. The rest of the crew stood frozen, processing impossible information. "Hotshot Crew 7?" Torres managed. "The crew that saved Riverside Subdivision during Cedar Fire?" His voice carried disbelief. Marshall nodded. "Ghost here was their lead firefighter for 3 seasons. Best I ever saw at reading fire behavior and tactical decisions under pressure. Lost her to burnout after Shasta Fire, but looks like she still got it." Kira felt heat rise in cheeks. That was a long time ago. Different life. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Rhett was staring with something that looked like awe mixed with shame. "You saved the neighborhood. While we were trapped, you saved the whole town." His voice carried disbelief and shame in equal measure. Weight of their treatment seemed to hit him all at once. 6 months of dismissal, of weekend warrior jokes, of treating her like furniture. Other crew members stood silently, faces, reflecting similar emotions. Embarrassment, shame, dawning respect that came far too late. Radio crackled. "All units, Willowbrook Fire is 100% contained." Victory announcement that felt hollow in the heavy silence. But Rhett wasn't listening to radio anymore. He was looking at Ghost, trying to understand how he'd been so completely, utterly wrong about someone who'd been right there the whole time. 6 months later, Kira stood at front of Station 3 training room. 30 faces stared back at her. New volunteer program had drawn interest from across state. Half belonged to existing volunteers wanting to improve skills. Other half were new recruits drawn by a story of weekend warrior who'd saved their town. In back row, Dave took notes with intensity of graduate student. He'd enrolled officially and was turning into one of her best students. Sarah had discovered passion for emergency medical services, already halfway through paramedic certification. Tom had become equipment specialist, could rebuild a pump in his sleep. Door opened quietly. Rhett slipped in with humility of someone who'd learned hard lessons. He'd been attending classes for 2 months, approaching wildland firefighting with respect that would have been impossible before Willowbrook Fire. Their relationship had evolved, not quite friendship, but mutual respect built on shared understanding of what the job demanded. "Tonight we're talking about tactical decision-making under pressure," she said, clicking to next slide. It showed photo of herself at 26, covered in ash, standing with CAL FIRE Hotshot Crew. Word, Ghost, clearly visible on yellows. "This is who I used to be, not who I am now." She clicked to next slide, photo from Willowbrook Fire, taken by news helicopter, her crew of volunteers protecting Oak Street. "This is who we are. This is what matters." After class, Rhett approached her desk. "I owe you an apology. For 6 months of outside, station alarm was sounding for structure fire on Pine Street. Professional crew rolling out with efficiency her training program had helped instill." "You don't owe me anything," she cut him off. "Just be better. That's all anyone can do." Through window, she watched Engine 3 disappear into night. They carried themselves differently now, with confidence from proper training and humility from understanding stakes. After he left, Kira turned back to her desk. Tomorrow she'd teach fire behavior. Next week, incident command systems. Outside, Willowbrook slept peacefully under stars. The night air carried no smoke.